Hey, this is still the Chronic Rift, and I'm still Judy Fenari. Today we're going to delve into fantasy. J.R.R. Tolkien has been said to be the father of modern-day fantasy. Our panelists are going to discuss exactly how true this statement is. But first, here are some things that you should know about in order to be considered a well-rounded person. In September, Tor Books is going to be releasing a collection of Larry Niven's short stories, essays, and novellas entitled End Space. It includes some work that have not been seen before. Some that you know are What Can You Say About Manhole Covers, The Return of William Proxmire, and Brenda. And now, it's time for Column Meanie Watch. Psych! We don't know any more than you do! Except that a certain Chief O'Brien is going to be seen on a certain cover of a certain Next Generation comic book. And that's all we know, and that's all we're saying. But seriously, as the movie season winds down and the box office receipts are added up, the Riff would like to point out some of the winners and the losers of the season. Touchtone said that Dick Tracy would rival Batman, but it looked much better than it actually sounded and was. Sometimes it is not just good enough to look good. Aha. The winners are Total Recall, Ghost, and Arachnophobia. They have new ideas and concepts, or they put brand new interesting twists into old ones. They're still playing in movie theaters, so go see them if you haven't. And if you've already seen them, see them again. Then there's Flatliners. The concept of a bunch of medical students getting together and trying to find out the answers to life after death is rather interesting. But I found the gore to be gratuitous. I found the ending to be very predictable. And why do they insist on making good death movies turn out to have happy endings? Why? Two favorite TV shows are making their way to cable in the fall. Beauty and the Beast will be on the Family Channel in September, and The Avengers will be on Arts and Entertainment in October. A certain note is, not only will the Emma Peel and Tara King episodes be aired, but also the Honor Blackman. Ah yes. Finally, my idiot co-host would like to apologize. Twice he was told how to pronounce our director's name, and he still said it wrong. Our director's name is Paula Araya. Now apologize, Keith, and do the funny papers.
Sorry, Paula. Hi, I'm Keith DeCandido. This is Comic Art Commentary. Here's some news. Dark Horse Comics, an Oregon-based comic company, had their best summer ever this year, and they're trying very hard to continue it into their best fall, their best winter, and their best spring. Dark Horse came into prominence a couple of years ago with the rise of Paul Chadwick's Concrete, which received reams of critical praise, as well as a bunch of Harvey and Eisner awards. Other popular books of theirs include Bob Burden's Flaming Carrot Comics, which came to Dark Horse from Renegade Press, their spin-off of the movie Aliens, and their adaptation of the movie The Abyss, as well as their popular anthology, Dark Horse Presents, which has served as the springboard for a number of their popular works, including the aforementioned Concrete. They have a couple of current projects of note. They have two bi-monthly limited series written by the infamous Frank Miller of Dark Knight Presents, Daredevil, Ronin, and RoboCop 2 fame. There's the 4-issue Give Me Liberty, drawn by Watchmen artist Dave Gibbons, and the 3-issue Hard Boiled, drawn by Jeff Darrow. They also have a new Starstruck series. Starstruck was originally an off-Broadway play written by Elaine Lee with costume designs by Michael William Kaluta. It was later a graphic novel and 6-issue series published by Epic Comics, written by Lee and drawn by Kaluta, and then was a backup feature in Dave Stevens' Rocketeer Adventure magazine, published by Comico. It is now a 12-issue series from Dark Horse, subtitled The Expanding Universe. It will feature some old material from the Epic and Comico stories, as well as some new material by Lee and Kaluta. In September, they have two really big things planned. They are expanding with the 13th issue their European anthology book Cheval Noir, which is French for Dark Horse, to 80 pages. That issue will feature work by such luminaries as Jacques Tardy, François Chuiten, Benoit Pittel, Rick Geary, and Brian Beland, among others. They're also putting out the first issue of Dark Horse Insider, which is a company newsletter much like other comic company newsletters, except it will have a 2-page alien story written by Mike Richardson and drawn by Tim Vigil.
Keith?
Yes?
Do they still make Huey, Dewey, and Louie in comic books?
I don't know. I don't think so. Sorry.
Oh.
Damn. Sorry.
Oh. Okay.
Maybe they will someday. This is now an open plea. We want Huey, Dewey, and Louie in comic books. That is all. This week's comic in review is Eclipse Books' adaptation of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, written by Charles Dixon and drawn by David Wenzel. At least on this book. They've always been Chuck Dixon and Dave Wenzel in the past, but this is a prestige format series. Kat Ironwood, the editor-in-chief of Eclipse Books, told me that The Hobbit is their biggest seller this year. It has been adapted into 3 44-page issues. The second issue is on the stands right now. And Ironwood said they were trying for a ratio of 2 pages of prose to 1 page of comic adaptation. This is followed rather closely in practice, as there are 132 pages of comic, and the paperback I have at home of The Hobbit is 287 pages long. It is packaged very nicely, and upon the first glance it is lovely. But there are a number of rather large flaws with both Dixon and Wenzel's work. Dixon tries very hard to keep all of the important dialogue in, leaving the description to the art, but he's managed to ooze all the charm out of it. It just isn't silly enough. The Hobbit is a joy to read, especially out loud, and one of the reasons it's so popular is because of its charm and wit. You don't get the same feeling of fun from Dixon's abridgment that you get from Tolkien's novel. He also leaves out a very important plot point. There are 13 dwarves. They need a 14th person to come along, otherwise the expedition will be marred by bad luck. As it stands in the adaptation, this is never mentioned, so there's really no compellingly good reason why Bilbo should go along with the dwarves. The art looks gorgeous, but Wenzel has 2 big problems. First of all, he can't differentiate between the good species. Elves, humans, hobbits, and dwarves all look basically alike, with only minor variations. Thorin, the leader of the dwarves, and Gandalf the wizard both look exactly alike. Same hair, same pointed nose, same beard, same light blue clothing. In close-ups, you can't tell them apart at all. His second problem is that hobbits have hairy feet. Wenzel does not draw hairy feet. He draws ordinary feet that look like they have a thatch of fur glued on top of them. They are the most pathetic hairy feet I have ever seen. In his favor, his bad guys look really good. The trolls and Gollum especially. Finally, one problem with just the whole package is that it's too compressed. The 2-to-1 ratio just doesn't cut it. 2 pages from a book, especially one as rich and with as much detail as anything J.R.R. Tolkien writes, will require more than 1 page of comic to do it justice. This is a noble effort, but it falls short of being in any way satisfactory. The Hobbit is published by Eclipse Books in cooperation with the Tolkien estate. 3 issues long, 44 pages an issue, $4.95 an issue, and is available both at comic shops and directly by mail from the publisher. That's it for Comic Art Commentary this week. Next week I'll be taking a look at comics adapted to the screen, as well as reviewing a video called The Comic Book Collector, hosted by none other than Frank Gorshin. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born in British South Africa in 1892. He originally made a name for himself as a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford University, partly to provide a vehicle for the Elvish language that he had created, and partly to amuse his children. He wrote The Hobbit in 1937 as a children's book, taking place in the mythical land of Middle-earth. He later revised it slightly to accommodate a larger story called The Lord of the Rings that he was working on. Thanks to complications due to the fact that Britain was involved with a war at the time, the original version is uncopyrighted, and the revised edition has to come out with an authorial approved edition banner or some such on it. If the book you have doesn't have this, it might not be the revised story. The Lord of the Rings was published from 1954 to 1955 in 3 parts: The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. The trilogy was revised and reissued in 1966, and it was then that it attained the cult status that it still enjoys to the present day. Tolkien defined modern fantasy as we know it with these 4 books. There is not a fantasy story that has been written in the last 40 years that does not owe some debt to J.R.R. Tolkien. From the lesser works of Margaret Weiss, Tracy Hickman, and Alan Dean Foster, to the great tales of Paul Anderson, Ursula K. Le Guin, and L. Sprague de Camp. His work is also the primary inspiration for the Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game that became popular in the 1970s and is still going strong today. With Judy and I to discuss the work of this great fantasist are three Tolkien enthusiasts that we'd like to welcome to the show. Billy Coffey, a student at Manhattan College, Andrew Angelopoulos, a student at Hunter College, and Patrick Walsh, a writer who is working on his third novel. Pat, what do you think is the reason for Tolkien's enduring appeal over the last 40, 50 odd years?
Well, Keith, I would basically say that the story is Tolkien's real strength. He is an excellent storyteller. The model that he uses is really a classical story of the young innocent going out into the big bad world and to seek adventure. But what he ultimately wants to be is back home. It's the same thing you find in The Wizard of Oz, in The Prodigal Son.
Beowulf.
Beowulf, exactly.
So he's basically retelling a story that's been with us from the beginning.
Exactly, and you know, that's a good point, Andrew, because Tolkien, who has become the name in fantasy, was not attempting to write a fantasy. Of course, many people would say that before Tolkien there was no such thing as fantasy.
Right.
You have to realize when he wrote The Hobbit, that's really a children's story if you look at it. The way he wrote it in like first person, saying I, and
Very
he's like giving you...
condescending.
Yeah, he talks to you, the reader, as if you yourself are a child. You know?
Crossing the T's and dotting the I's.
Right. Then later on in The Lord of the Rings, then that's much more, that's adult reading right there.
Yeah, but he managed to keep the same feel to it. I mean, like I said before, The Hobbit's very silly, but he managed to keep the tone of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings without sounding condescending, without sounding like a children's book. It's still a sophisticated work of literature.
Oh, it is, definitely.
I think his attempt was to create a modern-day mythology. I mean, back in his days at the university, he was chums and taught with people, C.S. Lewis.
Right.
Man who's done an immense amount of work in the field of mythology and documentation and critiques. I mean, I think Tolkien's efforts were directed at creating 20th century man's mythology.
That's, again, that's another good point, Andrew. I'm sure you're going to get, Judy and Keith are going to get tons of cards and letters on this one, but I dare say that England, or modern-day England as it has come down from the time of the Roman invasion, does not have a mythology of its own. What Tolkien was attempting to do is write a mythology for England. And what he did was he adopted mythologies of England's neighbors and of those peoples that had influence on England, the Celts, the Germanic peoples, and the Nordic peoples.
Right.
And all those elements are found in Tolkien's books. What he's trying to do is create a modern-day mythology. At the time that Tolkien was writing, England was in a death spiral from its pre-World War I imperialistic glory.
Right.
And what we find in Tolkien is really the embodiment and glorification of good, solid Anglo-Saxon values.
Yes! Comforting values.
Absolutely. What was more comfy than the Hobbit hole?
Yeah.
His books.
And
It's
his
only
books.
drinking his
pipe.
tea and smoking his pipe and yes, eating his wheat cakes and basically just
And his
being very
garden.
pleasant.
Exactly. And what did they learn from their vast experience in the terrible, nasty, evil world?
That there's no place
Like
like
Like home.
When he wrote The Lord of the Rings, though, Europe was in the middle of the Second World War, too. You have to realize that.
That's right.
Yeah. It was published right after the war when England it had officially been unseated as a world power, basically after World War II.
Remember, Tolkien's research began way back in his early days. He'd been basically putting all this material together
For decades.
for decades.
For decades.
I mean, look at the appendix at the back of The Return of the King. He obviously, he sunk a lot of work
It
into
is
this.
tremendous. What Tolkien was trying to do is basically what Wagner tried to do in Germany with his operas and what Yeats tried to do in Ireland with his poems and plays.
Right.
He tried to, of course, Wagner and Yeats had a mythology to revive. Tolkien had to try to create one whole cloth. The problem is, it really doesn't work. You really can't do that. That's a tall order.
Well, that's an interesting point that You said I mean, what he was trying to do is create a mythology, and yet nobody remembers J.R.R. Tolkien as somebody who created a mythology for England. He is remembered as like we said before, the pioneer of modern fantasy.
And another thing didn't work for him. I read somewhere that you know, the Hobbit goes back, and he really couldn't go home again after seeing what he did, what he accomplished. He with the humans and
things had changed.
Yes, things had changed. Just like England had changed, they went out and made this big bad empire, and then they tried to come back and condense themselves back to England, and you can't do that anymore.
The Lord of the Rings is just as ominous as Orwell's 1984. What you see there is basically an allegory for England, who goes out innocent and comfortable into the great unknown, meets all sorts of perils, dangers, savage peoples, conquers them, and then tries to come back. And if it's not the same anymore,
It loses its innocence
it
along the
loses
way.
its innocence. What you end up with is post-colonial England.
Yeah. Actually, you could make a convincing argument that Sauron and Saruman sort of represent Hitler, Nazi Germany, or possibly Russia, or a combination of the two, or even the United States. All three of them are examples of can be seen as things that unseated England from their position up, as you know, the sun doesn't set on the British Empire. Thanks to that, that's not happening anymore, and that's a good analogy. The idea that because what Frodo and what Bilbo confront are basically the ultimate evil.
Exactly. I'd be careful not to draw very specific conclusions.
I actually don't buy it myself.
Many people make the mistake of confusing the ring for atomic weaponry. Tolkien, in his later years, when this theory had become current, stated that was patently untrue. That he had, as a matter of fact, developed his whole basic sketch for the story well before the Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Also,
Before
actually,
Hitler even.
I think I think it's a bad idea to draw that kind of parallel anyway that I mentioned, even though I mentioned it.
What'd you do?
One of the things, you be quiet. One of the things that makes Tolkien so, I think, so enduring and so impressive was that he didn't, he was working in the abstract with the human condition. One of the things I think that made him different from C.S. Lewis, C.S. Lewis tended to ground his work in Christian dogma.
Yeah.
Things were like good and evil in Christian terms. Sauron and Saruman are the evil in all of us. It represents what is bad in all human beings. It is not the Christian devil. It is not...
But that's where the attempt at mythology shows itself.
Right.
I mean, it's not theological.
No, and I think that's because it's a more universal message in that sense.
That's what all mythology is. The very essence of mythology is man overcoming himself, the obstacles in himself. And the way you do that is externalize those obstacles, making them into Saurons and orcs and
quests, for that matter.
And quests.
Something identifiable, something conquerable once you can identify what it is, where it comes from.
And once you
see that in
externalize it.
all folk and fairy tales and mythologies. And the African ones, the evil was anything that wasn't the village. Anything that was outside those confines was evil, and you had to pack together as a community. That's the difference between the African and the English one. It was like there's Frodo, there's Bilbo, one. But with the African, it was like the community binding together against the unknown evil. And that's, you see that in a lot of literature, Western literature, I should say, where the male, goes out and conquers all.
Always.
And that's my biggest complaint. Thank you very much.
Yes, there are no women in Tolkien.
Beowulf, etc.,
Yeah.
and company.
But, actually, it's interesting that's true in a couple others. In Greek terms, the word barbarian comes from a Greek word that means somebody who isn't Greek. You know, somebody who's outside, and that's a word that has connotations.
You're all barbarians.
Yes, we are all barbarians except Andrew. Andrew's Greek, he's not a barbarian. But the word has connotations of somebody who is evil, somebody you wouldn't want to invite over to dinner, you know. And it comes from a word that means somebody outside the village, basically.
I would never invite you to dinner.
Okay. Fine. But, one thing that Tolkien created that has not only endured but has been done to death was the Elvish-Dwarvish rivalry. That's something that Tolkien put in. He put in all these different species, the orcs, the ents, the elves, the dwarves, the humans, the hobbits, and that rivalry, that sort of animosity between the elves and the dwarves is something that has a vice grip, really, on fantasy at this point. And it's just...
When displaying, or when Tolkien set out to create his mythology, and you're turning around and you're basically trying to take what you see as the world and pack it into letters and put it on pages, you have to take into account the world that he lived in. He lived in a world where all the countries were at each other's necks. You know, you had, England had a pact with Russia and France, and everyone had treaties, and the rivalries were very real and very tangible. They existed there. And your world was circumscribed by it.
Yeah, when he wrote in 1937, they had been, since 1066, going back and forth with the France. With France. All right, fine, with the French. You know,
Sorry.
it's the ongoing battle with them. You know, that's just something he saw and that was ingrained.
I think it's something much more basic. Again, Tolkien is going back to the very roots of Celtic, Nordic, and Germanic mythology, and very important in those mythologies are elemental beings. The dwarves who dwelled under the earth, the elves who dwelled above the earth, and who in a sense were abstracted from the earth. The dwarves were an earthy sort of people. They dug in the ground, they got their fingernails dirty, you know. The elves, on the other hand, they would move without a trace. They seemed not to disturb. Exactly, extremely ethereal. And what that is, that represents two different views of the world and how to handle it.
Ariel and Caliban.
Exactly, exactly. And really, how do we, what the human being tries to do...
How each group deals with its environment and manages to survive.
Exactly, but what the human being tries to do is combine those two elements. See, in a sense, Tolkien and, again, his mythological predecessors attempted to show us that man is neither like a dwarf, who is solely, remember, Tolkien's dwarves were also money-hungry, absolutely materialistic. The dwarves, on the other hand, were absolutely ethereal.
The elves.
I stand corrected. The elves were absolutely ethereal. The lesson to be learned is that we can learn something from each of these people. The human being should encompass both of those ideas.
In a way, the hobbits sort of seem to be sort of halfway between the elves and the dwarves. And since the hobbits do actually come out as the heroes in all of these, in both.
Well, the hobbits are really more like children throughout the story. And then later on to the Lord of the Rings, you can see it in Frodo and Samwise. They're sort of mature, you know, and the others, Pippin and Merry. At the very start of it, they're much like children, you know, very curious, especially Samwise, who wasn't invited into the Council of Elrond, but he goes following because he's concerned about Frodo. He's like a child. He's concerned about his friend. And then later on, after they realize there's more out there, because most hobbits in the Shire, they sort of like had a little safe community, like you were saying, in the holes. They wouldn't go outside, you know. They thought anyone that went off was queer, that anyone that went off adventuring or traveling was queer. They all said, just stay down, settle easy. They were much like children, you know, getting into these little antics of theirs. Then later on, in The Lord of the Rings, after they realized the world was at stake, they sort of matured, the four of them especially.
Yeah. It's actually, that's funny that they're like children, because they have names, like, especially Merry and Pippin. Their names are Meriadoc and Peregrine, which are these nice adult-sounding names, and nobody calls them that.
Yeah, they call them Pippin and Merry, like little kids.
Exactly, and, you know, I think they're short. just to be obvious, they're short. But yeah, I think that's something you see, something Pat mentioned before. It's sort of like, you know, the quest, how you learn and come of age almost.
Right.
And that's something that's true to a lot of coming of age things, the idea that you mature and grow up. And also, at the end of The Lord of the Rings, when Merry comes back, he's wearing the glistening armor, and he's like galvanizing all the troops.
They're like heroes now, soldiers.
Yeah. And he's become the grown-up now that they all look up to, because he's gone out into the world and he's He's done it all.
But that you find in any mythology, and I think that's all he tried to do, is that the heroes, or the main character of the mythology, undergo a transformation. Sometimes they don't recover from it, and they're punished by the gods.
You could argue that Bilbo doesn't recover from it, really.
Bilbo does not recover from it. He pays for it for his entire life.
They ate of the tree of knowledge.
They've sinned.
In a sense, they have
They
sinned.
left. They were innocent.
He doesn't couch it in those
Eden.
terms, though. He doesn't make it seem like they've done anything wrong, though.
Because that's what he's doing is, again, updating the mythologies. There's no longer any clear-cut lines. There's no sin and not sin, but you really can't come back, though.
You don't have any, except maybe Sauron and Saruman are maybe pure evil, but a lot of the actual characters we get to meet and look at aren't really all good and all evil. There's shades of gray to all of them. I mean, Gandalf can be damn manipulative.
Well, Sauron himself and Saruman, they did not start out evil. They were both corrupted. Like
Yes,
Saruman,
so was
when he
Gollum.
first came to Middle-earth, was like Gandalf. His job was to stop Sauron. But then along the way, he went the wrong way. He tried to study Sauron's ways in order to defeat him, and that entrapped him. In a sense, Sauron entrapped him by that, and it was his own fault that he turned evil. And Sauron himself was originally, almost like a Valar. He was like Maya, a godlike spirit, and he was also entrapped by the first Dark Lord, Morgoth, the first one. But they were originally they were not evil. They were just corrupted.
Right. And I think that's one of his big arguments, is that there are no good people and there are no bad people. There are simply people who are corrupted or people who aren't corrupted.
Much like Vader. Star Wars.
There's a classical mythology for you folks, the Star Wars mythology.
But that's a good point, though.
It is.
The Star Wars trilogy is much like the Tolkien trilogy. I mean, I think the parallels are obvious.
Yeah, well, yeah. You could make Luke.
I mean,
and Frodo.
exactly.
Luke and Frodo.
You
are
can make
practically
Ben
the same
Kenobi. Guess who?
Yeah.
Gandalf.
Right. All right, who's Yoda? Come on.
All right. Enough, though. We have to stop.
We have to stop?
We have to
I don't
stop.
want to stop.
Well, we have to.
I want
Before
to
we
stop.
stop, though, this is Carl, our producer. This is John Estru, our producer.
We wanted to invite him
This
in.
is what he looks like, okay? And
We've gotten dozens of letters of people wondering
want
what
to
our
know
producer
who
looked like,
is John Drew.
So that's him, folks.
I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, for being on the show.
Thank you.
very
Thanks for
much.
the
It's been a great experience.
Stop that.
And our topic for next week are the women of science fiction and fantasy. And I'd just like to tell you to tune in,
Turn on. Drop
out. Bye. Talk 'em up.